Hello, I'm Kathleen Olive. Welcome to Limelight Arts Travels Along the Apennines tour. I want to introduce this tour to you and explain what it is that we see and why these three regions of Italy that we'll visit are so interesting. The Apennines is the mountainous spine that runs down the entire length of the Italian peninsula, and it was formed many years ago by volcanic action. So it is geographically a relatively young, and also it can be a relatively unstable part of the Italian peninsula. But that ancient volcanic action also gives to the land, first of all, its amazing landscapes, the mountains, for example, with Gran Sasso, one of the highest peaks in all of Italy in the Apennine chain in Abruzzo. But it also gives the landscape particular adaptations and uses by humans over the millennia, from caves that sheltered early people living in these regions of Italy, through to high pastures on which sheep could be grazed, leading particularly to the development of the historical and economic fortunes of the region of Abruzzo in particular, but also soils that have been suited to particular types of agriculture and, of course, viticulture. So particularly in these three regions of Abruzzo, Umbria and Lazio, we see in central Italy landscapes that are particularly suited to the growing of vines and therefore to winemaking. Some of Italy's most prestigious modern wines are grown, for example, in the region of Umbria, but also to agriculture. So as we start this tour, we start in the region of Abruzzo. This is perhaps of the three regions we visit, the least known by international travellers to Italy. Now, for a country such as Australia, Abruzzo is a region that gave us many of our Italian immigrants in the 20th century. So there is a strong connection for countries like Australia and America to this region of Abruzzo simply by virtue of modern immigration. But in terms of travellers to Italy, particularly cultural travellers, this is a region that has been much less on the tourist map. And as we'll see, I think that's actually connected to the historical and particularly economic fortunes of the region of Abruzzo, sometimes called the Abruzzi, plural in English, but let's just call it Abruzzo. That's what the Italians call it. And this region is more historically connected, as we'll see, to the south of Italy, so to regions like Puglia, but also Campania, which was for centuries the capital of a very important political state on the Italian peninsula, the so-called Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, or sometimes just known as the Regno, or Kingdom. And Abruzzo has been connected to that southern part of Italy much more than to the central and northern part of Italy over its history. And that's partly, in fact, because of the geography, because of the terrain. So you can see neighbouring Lazio to the bottom left of your screen here. That's where Rome is, for example. It's where we commence our tour at the airport in Rome. And when we travel up to our first base of the tour, which is in the Abruzzo, you'll see that we actually have to travel quite high up into the mountain chain. So the earliest people who lived in the region of Abruzzo, which goes all the way to the Adriatic coast, as you can see, with significant towns like Pescara, for example. And one of the ways that Abruzzo is often characterized is being tra mare e monti, between the sea and the mountains. That's also a really good characterization of the cuisine of Abruzzo. It's very famous in Italy for its surf and turf, mare monti, as the Italians would say. But when we travel up into the Abruzzo to commence our tour, with our first base being in the small, very pretty town of Sulmona, and in fact, all of our accommodations on this tour, all of the bases we have for accommodation are characterized by being in small, pretty, provincial towns in some cases, in other cases villages, and so that is something to keep in mind. We are going off the well-worn tourist track. The hotels are not of the same size or even comfort level as you might expect for a 4-star hotel in a major city like Rome, Florence, Venice. No, we're in small provincial centres, we're in simple accommodation, clean and also with comfort and elegance, but not on the same scale as you would expect from a large city. And I hope that's actually one of the things that you're looking forward to about a tour such as this one, is getting a little bit off the beaten track. So we start off the beaten track in Sulmona, and to get there from Rome Airport, we actually have to go up and through the mountain chain of the Apennines. And this was a barrier in some ways to the early settlement of the Abruzzo. So there is documentation of quite ancient prehistoric settlements in the Abruzzo, up in the mountains, in the caves. The Abruzzo, much of the Abruzzo, in fact, today is actually a very large national park, one of Italy's earliest national parks, in fact, in the 20th century. And there is an enormous amount of wildlife, which did allow for inhabitation. It did allow for a food source, but it also we also see wild in terms of endemic wildlife in the Abruzzo. We are talking about animals like wolves and bears as well. So there were some risks to the early humans who settled in the Abruzzo, but they were living in caves. They were living very simple lives of hunter-gatherers. Abruzzo really comes to historic record, so comes out of the prehistoric period with the growth of the much larger settlement of Rome to its south, down in the plain towards the other coast of Italy, the Tyrrhenian coast of Italy. And it's in the 3rd century BCE that the Romans have themselves established enough to a degree that they think, who's living up in those mountains up above us? Who are the people of those Italic tribes? The people living in the Abruzzo region at that period are known as Italic people, one of the kind of names given to a whole group of different tribes living in the Italian peninsula. So who are those people up there, and what are we going to do about them? What's the benefit to us in conquering this difficult mountainous territory to hold, but also what are some of the risks inherent in that? Can we use this area as a way to get over to the Adriatic coastline? Are the mountain passes too difficult? These are all the kinds of considerations in terms of Rome's conquest of the area of the Abruzzo. But that starts to happen from the 3rd century BCE, and as is Rome's wont, the city begins to found colony cities in the area of the Abruzzo. Just have a little piece of fluff on my face. Sulmona, the town where we're going, is one of those. It's a town with you can see it circled here in blue on the map. It's a town with a strong Roman past. In fact, it's the town where in the 1st century BCE, the Roman writer and poet Ovid was actually born. So it has a very long association for that reason with Rome, thanks to Ovid's birth there. So there are some small colonies that are founded by Rome, like Sulmona, for example, but the area is just quite difficult to hold. So difficult, in fact, that with the fall of Rome, the Abruzzo really kind of falls into a rapid decline. And by the 6th century, it has come under the political grouping of most of central northern Italy, which at that point in time is under a group that's come from Eastern Europe. That's the so-called Lombards. So it does, like Umbria, where we visit, fall under this loose political control of the Lombards, but it remains a very rugged and remote kind of area for any kind of conqueror to subdue. And this also means that with the rise of Christianity, it becomes an area in which Christian hermitages flourish. Now, some of these are established by hermit monks who come from quite far-flung places. They come from the east of the Mediterranean, from places like Syria. They land on the Adriatic coast of Italy, and these small groups of Christian Syrian monks start to really retreat into the wilderness of the mountains of the Apennines, as you see here. This is a hermitage known as Santo Spirito a Maiella. The Maiella National Park is in some ways a kind of heart of the Abruzzo. It's wild, it's mountainous, it's rugged, but as you can see here, it's also very beautiful. It's where prehistoric people lived in the Abruzzo. It's where shepherds would graze their flocks and then move their flocks in the regular annual transhumance down very ancient paths to Puglia and to the south of Italy. So these early Christian communities begin to crop up, not just in Abruzzo, but also in Umbria, where we'll also visit, in the mountains as a kind of wild manifestation of early Christian monasticism. But then with the growth of the Benedictines in Italy from that same kind of period, so from the very period in which Rome declines and we see the growth of Western monasticism, particularly under St. Benedict himself from Umbria, and others like him. We start to see then a transition from these early Eastern communities living in the mountains in Christian hermitages to slightly larger Benedictine communities doing the same thing. So Santo Spirito a Maiella, which you see here, is founded in the 11th century as a Benedictine monastery out in the vast wilderness of the Maiella Massif or mountain chain. And it is, as you can see, very much built into the rock face of the mountain itself. And that's something that we'll see in a number of the places we visit. We'll see these extraordinary Christian hermitages that form part of the very mountains themselves. But even this begins to fall into decline. We see a real push-pull in the area of the Abruzzo. And the reason there's a political push-pull in the area of the Abruzzo is because despite its wildness, despite the rugged nature of the terrain, there are commodities here that are of interest. And the particular commodity that is of interest in the Abruzzo is in fact sheep. So this is an area that is great for pasturing the flocks and then moving them down the mountains, down ancient paths of transhumance, so ancient that in fact they're now protected by UNESCO World Heritage listing, all the way down the Abruzzo mountain chain to the south of Italy, to places like Foggia in present-day Puglia, but even further. And this is something that later is really going to tie the history of this region to the south of Italy rather than to the north of Italy, despite being kind of smack bang in the geographical centre of Italy. Abruzzo's modern history is not tied to the industrialization of the north, but is rather tied to a kind of agricultural neglect that we see in the south, but we'll come to that. So these ancient paths of moving sheep back and forth and these early Christian communities, first from the east, but then more local in terms of the Benedictine, are something that means there is always a political interest by conquerors, by foreign powers in this region. And because of its wildness and because of its remoteness, it's also territory, as I said, that is quite difficult for those rulers to hold. So we will see examples of this with the extraordinary, we would call it encastellation or fortification of the region of the Abruzzo. This is a very, very scenic fortress or rocca of a town called Calascio, a town that was quite badly impacted by an earthquake in the 16th century. But you can see here the ruins of a 14th century fortress, the so-called Rocca di Calascio, that was ruined in that Renaissance earthquake, but which subsequently then proved an extraordinary film set for movies like Lady Hawk, which I would highly recommend to you if you can find that on YouTube, or if you can borrow a copy maybe from a library on DVD. This is a movie from the 1980s, which was entirely filmed in Italy, with a large portion of it filmed in the extraordinary landscapes of the Abruzzo. You really get a sense of how wild and inhospitable that landscape could be. So we will visit this fortress and we'll walk up to this fortress on the tour. The person who really brings to the Abruzzo a spirit of peace again after a time of quite strong political struggle is a man who is known to posterity by two names. One is Pietro da Montemorrone, or Pietro da Morrone, Morrone being a mountain in the Abruzzo, so he is a local. And the other name by which he's known to posterity is Celestine V. Until the retirement of our own Pope Benedict, the retirement of a pope before his death within the so-called chair of St. Peter had only previously happened once. And that was in fact in 1294, in the less than 12-month period in which a monk from the region of Abruzzo, who had in fact founded an order, a monastic order that was designed to reform the Benedictines, bring them back to kind of their early roots in terms of their mission of working and praying. And that man was elected in 1294 against his will wasn't something that he really saw in the path of his own life. He was elected Pope with the name, taking the name of Celestine V. And in fact, the community of monks that he founded is also known as the Celestine community today. He was a local through and through. So before being Pope, he really had a focus on reforming monasticism in this area of the Abruzzo and bringing a kind of a Christian civilized ethos of peace and kindness to this remote, wild, rugged area that was much more inhabited by crafty and sometimes, morally suspect shepherds, for example, who could live quite a wild life in which there was more than a degree of banditry in many cases, something that actually, something in terms of the reputation of shepherds that really predominates in Italy. If you think about, for example, Sardinia or Corsica, this idea of shepherds as being, on the edges of our community and therefore a little more morally suspect, a little more in need of Christian charity. But also after his brief papacy, Celestine V returns to this area of the Abruzzo. He doesn't have a great posthumous reputation in his own time. Chroniclers of his own time, the late 13th century, they say he is induced to give up the papacy by foul means, not fair. And the blame for that is laid at the feet of the Pope who follows him, Boniface VIII, a Pope who is known in his own time as bringing great division to not just Italy, but Western Europe. So much so that Dante reserves a place in hell for Boniface VIII, but also has some harsh words for Celestine. Dante is the one who gives Celestine V, who founded the institution you're looking at on the screen here. It's Dante who says that Celestine made the so-called gran rifiuto, or great refusal, giving up the papacy. Celestine actually made the way open for a much worse person, Boniface VIII, who would so divide Western Christian Europe, Dante thought. Celestine, that's somewhat unfair. Celestine's contemporary reputation, as I said, was not great. He was seen as paving the way really for a worse person through his personal weakness. This was how it was seen at the time. But in the Abruzzo, he is right in his own time, but also down to the modern era. He has a great reputation, a saintly reputation, for founding large institutions such as this one. This is the Abbey of Santo Spirito al Morrone. It's kind of the heartland of where he comes from, a reformed Benedictine community not far from the town of Sulmona, where we begin our tour. And so in his own region, Celestine, or Pietro da Morrone, is seen as bringing a kind of a reformed Christian ethos to an area that was otherwise quite wild and remote. And remember, the thing that's really connecting the region of the Abruzzo to southern Italy, less so to Rome and to northern Italy, is the so-called Via degli Abruzzi, or the Tratturo Magno, the great path of transhumance. On the map you're looking at here, that's the black line that takes you from the today one of the capitals of the region of the Abruzzo, and that's the city of L'Aquila, or the Eagle, which you see right at the top left of your screen. And that black line that connects L'Aquila all the way to Foggia is just one of the ancient transhumance paths used since Roman times. You can see all the other coloured lines, or all of the other possible ways to take your sheep down to Puglia for sale. Puglia, the region of the kingdom of the two Sicilies, or the Regno as it was known, had a vast population. It also had great ports at places like Pescara or Bari, for example, where animals could be, or carcasses of animals, or the fleece of animals could be shipped if necessary. Over time, there are also paths from the Abruzzo that connect the Abruzzo to the great port of Naples. And so this trade in sheep, and then the kind of financial market that has to grow up around the selling of the sheep, the selling of the animals, but also of the commodities that the animals produce. This is something that means that the Abruzzo does become a commercial area, and a well-connected area, because of these paths, which have to be taken eventually, not just by sheep and shepherds, but also by merchants, by bankers, by financiers, by all of the people involved in the transaction around the very big sheep industry in all of its forms in the Abruzzo. And we do well to remember that connection that the Abruzzo has when we're in, for example, some of the small Christian churches and oratories of the Abruzzo. Here you're looking at the oratory of San Pellegrino a Bominaco, a very small Christian oratory in a reasonably isolated village of the Abruzzo. But like many of the painted churches we'll visit rather, entirely covered in the 13th and 14th century by highly decorated, quite sophisticated encyclopedic fresco cycles. So the walls have been plastered, and while the plaster is damp, the pigment has been pressed and painted into that damp plaster, giving us these extraordinary, almost Christian books that unfold on the walls of these small churches and oratories. It's quite extraordinary to find such sophisticated and prestigious work. You know, the colors that you see here, like blue and green, they've come from far away. They're not local pigments. So this is a very expensive work that you're looking at. And this should be a reminder to us that as remote as it was, the Abruzzo also had to be well connected thanks to that trade in sheep in particular, and the market, the financial market that grows up around that. And the financial market, and really the kind of core of the commercial interests of the Abruzzo, was located in the town of L'Aquila, which was originally just a small little conglomeration of villages. You see it circled here in blue on your map. But is in over time an area that becomes much more important thanks to the interest of the, in fact, Sicilian Normans in the south of Italy. So as the Sicilian Normans from the 11th century are embarking on a conquest of southern Italy and Sicily, they realize the connection of the area of the Abruzzo to southern Italy because of the trade in sheep and because of the roads, the paths that are maintained to move the sheep around. And they also realize the commercial potential of that trade. And that's why in 1254, the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II, the last of the great Sicilian Normans of southern Italy, decides to take that little conglomeration of villages in the area of today's L'Aquila and found from them an imperial city, so imperial that he gives it his own ensign. As Holy Roman Emperor, he gives that ensign to the entire new town that he's founded. So the town is known as the Eagle, or Aquila, or L'Aquila. And this is a view over L'Aquila. You can see it here kind of sliding down a hill in the central part of the Abruzzo. You've got an extraordinary view here over a Spanish fort built in the 16th century at the top of this town of L'Aquila as a way to surveil everything that's happening in the area, built at the time of the Spanish control of southern Italy, which doesn't concern us quite so much, so I'll leave that to one side. L'Aquila is a trade centre. It's an economic centre. For this reason, it's also a place where vice can proliferate, and that means that people like St. Bernardino of Siena in the 15th century feels a real burning mission to come to L'Aquila. Even though it's quite a journey for him from Siena in Tuscany, he journeys here in the 15th century in order to preach to the merchants and the traders of L'Aquila and encourage them to be honest in how they go about this business of dealing and selling in sheep and sheep products. So he spends, in fact, a significant amount of time here, so significant that, in fact, he finishes his time in the city of L'Aquila. St. Bernardino of Siena dies and is buried here in the town of L'Aquila. And this town, as you see from the Spanish fort, it remains of great interest to the rulers of southern Italy, to the Spanish and then to the Bourbons, for example. So this is one reason why Abruzzo is so much more connected to the history of the Italian south rather than to the centre and north, thanks to this historic connection because of the trade in sheep and the economy that gives rise to. But as I'm sure you know, this is a geographically troubled part of Italy. It is frequently affected by earthquakes. The most recent damaging earthquake in this part of Italy at L'Aquila occurred in 2009, when over 300 people were killed in quite a strong series of earthquakes and aftershocks. many of them because buildings hadn't been built with strength the first time around. And as I'm sure you also know, but as you will also discover, this is quite a strong political debate that continues. The very long, slow rebuilding of the town of L'Aquila, which to this day remains to some extent quite underpopulated. From the Abruzzo, we move to Lazio, and this is a region that has quite a different history to the Abruzzo, despite being adjoining regions, despite being part of the same Apennine mountain chain. Umbria has a different ancient history, but therefore also a different modern history. It's connected in different ways. So whereas the Abruzzo is connected to the south of Italy thanks to the movement back and forth of sheep over the seasons, Umbria is connected to northern Italy because of a concerted Roman effort to do that. So despite having quite a similar geography thanks to the Apennine chain, Umbria gets a different connection in Italy thanks to the Via Flaminia. This is one of the earliest, most significant Roman roads, like the Appian Way, with which you might be more familiar. The Flaminian Way is a similarly amazing piece of Roman engineering that travels up and through the area of Umbria, which had also been inhabited in ancient times by so-called uncivilized and wild people. That's how the Romans to their south characterized them. But through that territory, Rome becomes very interested in opening up, from the time of Augustus and beyond, a very easy path to reach the northern parts of the Italian peninsula. And that is the Via Flaminia, named for the person who looks after that project. If you visited Rome and you've been to Piazza del Popolo, where you find Santa Maria del Popolo, a church with some wonderful Caravaggio paintings and some wonderful architectural work by Raphael, well, that in fact is the place where the Via Flaminia begins, in Piazza del Popolo. And it takes you due north out of Rome, as you can see here, and would eventually have connected you to Rimini. So Umbria comes under Roman interest thanks to this engineering project of the Via Flaminia, and then thanks to the connections that allows, that road makes possible between Rome and territories in the northern parts of the Italian peninsula. And that's also why a number of the towns in Umbria again have a Roman origin. So that's towns like pretty little village of Bevagna, for example, but also one of the most important but least known Roman archaeological sites in all of Italy, and that's the town of Carceri, which is where I'm moving the black arrow around on the screen right now. It's directly on the Via Flaminia, but for reasons unknown, it was later abandoned, becomes a bit of a quarry in the Middle Ages and Renaissance for surrounding structures. People just go and take the rocks, the stones from the Roman town of Carceri, and use them to build new things. But in fact, it's one of the largest Roman archaeological sites in Italy, one of the least excavated, unfortunately. As you can see, it's got quite a wild kind of nature. It's very little known. Some imagination is required when you visit Carceri, as with many archaeological sites, but it's one that gives us a sense of the importance of the Via Flaminia for connecting this region of Umbria to the rest of northern Italy, as opposed to Abruzzo, which is much more connected, as I've said, to the south. Umbria today is much better known than the region of Abruzzo. That's because from the 1990s, it really became seen by non-Italians, or it must also be said actually by some extent by Italians as well, as a cheaper alternative for buying a lovely country villa than neighboring Tuscany. So Umbria was just that little bit further away, just that little bit less known, so that much more affordable. And so Umbria's profile in terms of cultural tourism was a little bit later to develop, but it did develop earlier than the profile of somewhere like the Abruzzo, which is only just being recognized as a cultural destination by non-Italians today. And Umbria, when we think of it today, we often think of it for its beautiful little well-preserved medieval villages. And again, our base in the area, which is in a little town called Todi. is precisely that kind of a village. So I've circled in blue here on the map, more or less the location of Todi where we'll stay. Hopefully you can see from the map that Umbria as a region is characterized by mountains, yes, just like the Abruzzo, but more than the Abruzzo also by wide plains, and those are around major rivers, one of which, for example, is the Tiber. You can see the Tiber on this map just above the blue circle that I've put to indicate the location of Todi. So we've got these two river valleys, in fact, in Umbria, with mountain chains running kind of on either side of the Tiber River Valley, as you can see here. And so the mountain villages of Umbria are separated by these plains, the plains through which the Romans tended to build their roads, but also their settlements. Todi is a lovely little village. It's kind of characterized, its profile is really characterized by this beautiful 16th century church, very small but perfectly planned church that grew up to protect a miraculous image that started to work miracles in this church. And it's believed that this church was designed by none other than Bramante, one of the key 16th century painters, but more particularly architects. Someone who, for example, is able to help work out, together with Raphael, how to put a dome on St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. So a lovely little example of what's thought to be his architecture in the town of Todi. But Umbria doesn't really get on the map after Rome. So we have Rome's interest in the region. Umbria becomes part of the political unit of the Lombards in Italy, more specifically a Lombard territory known as the Duchy of Spoleto. So it does have this kind of political interest, but it's more or less abandoned. It's abandoned to local conflict and factional infighting. And it really only emerges from that with a key figure who I'm sure you're familiar with, who emerges, is born in the little town of Assisi, which we'll visit, which I've circled here for you on the map in blue. And it's only with the birth of St. Francis of Assisi in that town on Monte Subazio's slopes that Umbria really starts to be put on the map for something other than factional conflict and fighting. When Francis is born in 1181, that is what characterizes this region: political strife and fighting. And Francis, as an early mission after his conversion to a kind of a true heartfelt Christianity and not just a nominal one, he does make peace one of his major missions. And then that mission takes him beyond his own area of Assisi and Umbria, as far away as North Africa, for example, but also to Rome, where he seeks legitimation for the way of life, the very hard, poor and difficult way of life that he advocates as the first of the Franciscans, as they will be known. But by the time he dies in 1226, he already has a contemporary reputation for saintliness, for really walking the walk and talking the talk, both at the same time. And so the place of his burial immediately after his death becomes a site of pilgrimage. And immediately we have to see the construction of not one, but two basilicas stacked on top of one another, as you can see in this image of the Basilica of St. Francis in Assisi. And then out the back, extending the spine of the ridge of the mountain on which Assisi is built, a huge monastery to accommodate the ever-growing number of brothers and sisters in the order of the Poor Clares, thanks to the work of St. Clare of Assisi, the friend and kind of female equivalent of St. Francis. We just end up with this huge, almost immediate building project that starts to put Assisi on the map. And that building project on the inside is covered by artworks by some of the most important artists working in Italy at that time, from Cimabue, whose ruined works you see on the left and the right, lower left and right from this internal image of the upper church of Assisi, through to highly debated works by possible Giotto, which decorate the side walls of the central nave that you're seeing here from behind the altar, looking towards the doors of the upper Basilica of Assisi, to downstairs in the lower church, documented works by great artists like Simone Martini and the Lorenzetti brothers from Siena. So the greatest medieval painting traditions in Italy, whether they're from Florence or Siena or Rome, all of them have a focus, a center of concentration in this one project of the Church of St. Francis in Assisi. And this is what puts central Italy on the artistic map. We tend to think of places like Florence or Pisa or Siena as the birth of great Renaissance art. But really, there's a strong case to be made that it's this huge building project that brings all of those artists together that gives rise then to the movement we would know as the Italian Renaissance. And that continues, that interest in art in Umbria continues even though we don't hear so much about it. It continues, for example, in places like Spoleto, which we'll visit, which is circled on the map here in blue, a town with ancient kind of Roman origins, but which in the 15th century is the place where Filippo Lippi, wonderful Florentine painter, executes his last work together with his son Filippino and his assistant Sandro Botticelli. In fact, Filippo Lippi dies in the town of Spoleto while working on this project of beautiful frescoes that you see in the Cathedral of Spoleto here. But also to the north of the region of modern-day Umbria in the town of Perugia, we also see there a concentration of great art. We see artists like Piero della Francesca passing through. Earlier still, we see great sculptors from Pisa, the Pisano family workshop, for example, working on outdoor works of sculpture here, fountains. But we also then in the 16th century see in the town of Perugia the emergence of a local painter, nicknamed in fact Perugino. Here you see his frescoes in the Collegio del Cambio in Perugia, which we visit, which he worked on its foot together with probably a young Raphael. Perugino is someone who takes all of the Renaissance interests of art from proportion and perspective and kind of a naturalistic approach to showing the world around us, and infuses it with a very local understanding of light, of hazy, water droplet-filled atmosphere, of beautiful vistas and landscapes, of a soft kind of mysticism that has been associated with Umbria since the time of St. Francis. And without someone like Perugino and his local influences on his well-trained Renaissance painting, we don't get someone so key as Raphael, who spends a formative part of his training with Perugino. So Umbria, although it's a little later to come to the map in terms of its cultural attractions, from the beginning, in fact, it's been just as interesting an artistic destination as places like its better known neighbour Tuscany. The other thing about central Italy, where we're travelling through the Apennine chain, is that of course the geography and the very soil itself, the terroir we might say, are really perfect for agriculture, but particularly, as I said, viticulture. So around Umbria, but also in Abruzzo and also in Lazio, where we conclude our tour with sites that we visit. We have a strong concentration of wine growing, which from the 20th century has given Italy some of its most prestigious wines. So in Umbria, we have reds like Sagrantino and Montefalco Rosso, two of the most prestigious Italian reds. In the Abruzzo, the red wine that we'll be drinking is Montepulciano d'Abruzzo, a particular type of variety of that grape as it's made into wine in the Abruzzo. And then we also have great white wines, thanks to the mineral qualities of the soil in the Apennine chain. So we have, for example, in Umbria, a lovely white wine called Greco di Tufo, and in Orvieto, which is the final base for us on this tour in the region of Umbria, we also have a wonderful white wine called Orvieto Classico or Orvieto DOC, because in fact it has that listing of one of the highest appellations that are given to Italian wines. So all of these very local, very typical wines. Orvieto is technically within the region of Umbria. It feels more like it's connected to Rome thanks to its proximity, but it's not in the region of Lazio in which Rome is found. It's in the region of Orvieto, so it's our final base for forays that we'll make into the area of Lazio. Now, this part of central Italy, this part of the Apennine chain around Orvieto, but around the towns of northern Lazio that we visit, so in the area of Viterbo, for example, the landscape here is very, very particular. These are known as the so-called tufa towns of central Italy, and Orvieto is one of them. You can see these are outcrops of quite a soft, almost sandstone-like stone known as tufa that does erode. It erodes with water and it erodes with wind over time. And so Orvieto, you can see, is perched on one of these outcrops that over time is becoming more and more eroded, more and more dramatic, gives that interesting kind of geographic dimension to this region, gives it also that interesting dimension to its soils as well. It also gives this part of the region of Lazio near Umbria volcanic lakes, such as we see at Bolsena and Bracciano, those two big blue dots that you see on the map here. So geographically, it's a really interesting part of Italy, and that volcanic origin that gives these towns and gives these regions their particular kind of profile in terms of the soil, in terms of the landscape, was also something that was exploited by the earliest people who lived there. So in Orvieto, for example, we'll see sites that were excavated by hand, remember, by the Etruscans. Tufa is a soft stone. It can be quarried out by hand. This is an underground archaeological site just underneath the streets of Orvieto that shows how the Etruscans tunneled into the soft tufa stone in this area of Umbria and also northern Lazio around Viterbo. They could quarry it by hand, and we'll see some wonderful examples of the kind of structures that they quarried out by hand and which date back to pre-Roman times in this part of Italy. That underground kind of quality of places like Orvieto persists into the 16th century because it could be so easily worked by hand, relatively speaking. So the other thing that we'll visit in Orvieto that shows us that kind of underground quarrying aspect of the so-called tufa towns in this part of central Italy is the Well of St. Patrick, or the Pozzo di San Patrizio. This was quarried by hand in 1527 to be a well, as you can see at the bottom, by a papal engineer, Antonio da San Gallo the Younger, a really good friend of Michelangelo. And it was quarried in 1527 for Pope Clement VII, because if you know your historical dates, 1527 is when Rome is being sacked by some unpaid soldiers of the Holy Roman Emperor. Clement VII has fled to Orvieto. He decides to have a very large step well constructed in order for donkeys to be able to go down to the bottom of the well, draw water and come back up. And the amazing thing about the Well of St. Patrick in Orvieto is the engineering of Antonio da San Gallo the Younger that means that this is actually a double helix structure, so that the donkeys go down one way, come up the other way on these very shallow, easy steps without ever having to cross one another's paths. Quite an extraordinary work of 16th century Renaissance engineering. But it's made possible, as I said, because of the kind of geographic indications of this area. This is one of the tufa towns of northern Lazio / Umbria, the region we conclude our tour in, which gives you a sense of how delicate all of this geography is. This is a town called Civita di Bagnoregio. It is a tiny little tufa town, which is now inhabited by no more than a dozen people, more cats than people, in fact, which is so delicate because of the erosion that's happening over time. That led to depopulation centuries ago. There's a closer, more modern town that is connected to this little rocky outcrop of a village by the bridge that you can see people walking up. So there is a slope up and into this town. And then you walk back down to get out. Civita di Bagnoregio, it's just extraordinary. You can see how photogenic this town is. And in more recent times, in about the last 15 years, a very negative form of tourism arose in Civita di Bagnoregio, where people would arrive, take a photo on that modern bridge, and then flee. It's what's known as mordi e fuggi tourism in Italy, or eat and run. So this town was one of the first to introduce a tourist tax. You pay to cross the bridge to go into this town. And they've come up with some really interesting ways to encourage people to spend some time, but also importantly, spend a little bit of money in this village. And we'll talk more about those when we get there. But our final focus of the tour in Lazio, so in the northern part of the region in which Rome is found, which we visit from a base just across the border in Orvieto, is in the papal gardens that were possible in this kind of landscape. So with those volcanic lakes, with those dramatic hills, with the mineral quality of the soil, the breezes that you would get in elevation. All of this in the 16th century was very attractive to popes and cardinals in the stiflingly hot and humid and malarial city of Rome to the south. So to the north and south, in fact, of Rome is a chain of volcanic lakes with volcanic hills. And in both of these places, north and south of Rome, we see popes and cardinals concentrating their interest in the 16th century with extraordinary villas and gardens. So you might be familiar with that of Tivoli to the east of Rome, but in the north of Rome, around the town of Viterbo, a town with really ancient papal associations, we see some extraordinary villas and gardens from the 16th century, made possible by the landscape, by terracing that's possible on those kind of eroding hillsides, by the mineral qualities of the soil, and by the extraordinary surrounding views. So we're going to focus on two of those. We'll focus on the amazing mid-16th century symbolic garden of the so-called Sacro Bosco, or sacred forest, sacred wood in Bomarzo. We don't really know very much about why this extraordinary garden was quarried out of the soft stone. Quarried, in fact, these sculptures quarried where they were actually found from the surrounding stone. So literally a garden carved out of the earth in order to give us amazing sculptures, huge monumental sculptures like the very famous grinning mask, which is actually a picnic table, as you will see in the garden at Bomarzo. And then another, really at the other end of the spectrum with which we conclude our tour, the hyper-civilized, hyper-structured, also mid-16th century garden, also very, very symbolic, but beautiful, classical Italian Renaissance garden of Villalante a Bagnaia. Again, also with its sculptural attributes carved out of the very stone that the landscape of central Italy, that spine of the Apennines, is made up of. So I hope you've enjoyed this introduction to the tour along the Apennines with Limelight Arts Travel, and I hope it gives you a greater appreciation of the cultural riches that await you in these regions of Italy. Thanks very much.